Welcome to my debate of the week, ladies and gentlemen. This is about Steve Austin versus Vince and Kenny McMahon in the podcast right after Raw. Now, I managed to see it. And I'm not going to cover everything in it, but I am going to cover a couple of things that I felt really gives you something to think about. When it comes down to it, was this an interesting podcast? It actually was. But I also feel that there was a lot of bullshit going on in that podcast where generally, and this is for me, anyone else who sees this, you're going to have a different point of view. And I understand your point of view. There was some things in there that's going to make you think, oh, Vince and Kenny McMahon is more of a person. He cares about people. And some are going to say he's nothing but a fucking bullshit artist. To me personally, he's in between. When you see how Austin was talking to him, that was very, very, very controlled. Steve was not going to give questions to things that was going to make Vince 100% uncomfortable. He wasn't going to do it. Even though he did grill him a little bit on certain things, he did make sure that this was not outside Vincent's comfort zone completely. He tried to make sure it was under control. And for the majority of that entire podcast, most of what was talked about was about Steve himself and what effect that Vince did on Steve. On his time when he went away from WWE because he got pissed off due to the fact he couldn't get the things he totally wanted. When he came back and he had gotten fined, I have to admit, I didn't know almost $700,000 the fine he was originally going to get. But he did convince Vince to bring it down to $250,000. But the point is that this podcast was more about them talking to each other and what effects each other have done to the business and on each other than anything else. When it came to the CM Punk this is the part that upset me a little bit. When it came to CM Punk, and it kind of reflects what happened with Vince versus Bret Hart. To me personally, it could be something different for you. Because of how Bret Hart was getting set up to go to WCW. And having to deal with giving up his title to someone in a certain way he wasn't really comfortable about. He wasn't willing to do it, and that's Bret. Now, I'm not 100% against Bret. I did like Bret, and I still do. But when it comes for business, you wanting to do what you want isn't always reflective of what happens in the company you're from. And in this situation, when it came to CM Punk and how Vince tried to explain himself, I can understand if there was no go-between between them because Austin had that problem with Vince. And it was Jim Ross who straightened that out, and we all know about that. When it came to Bret Hart, it was somebody else dealing with it. Some people say it was Stu Hart that helped sometimes when things weren't very straight with Vince. And it could have been Pat Patterson to a certain extent, or Art Anderson at certain points. I know Art Anderson wasn't there, but you know what I mean. I'm just saying in general that there are people that Vince has had go-betweens with that helps him to deal with talent that he has a friction with. I know Art Anderson to a certain extent has spoken to Vince, and sometimes, not every time, sometimes he speaks for talent in between, even though he's not his job. In this respect, saying that there was no go-between, really to a certain extent, I don't buy. Because I know from my own personal perspective that Vince can be a point where he can be a stubborn motherfucker. No matter how much Vince wants to say that he's a shy type of person in a small group. And I understand that myself. I'm not 100% great in big groups or small groups. I mean, I can talk to a certain extent to small groups of people and somewhat big groups. But when it comes to really big groups, I get nervous. Small groups, sometimes I can get nervous counting on how they are. So I'm not 100% against him. But him saying that there was no go-between and he could somewhat understand what Punk is going from, I don't totally buy. I don't buy it for the simple respect that for so much of the talent that has left WWE, and even though most of them have been nice and friendly about it, Vince is not one of the greatest people to work with. Particularly that there's certain points that he has been very prejudiced to certain people and racist. And I'm not saying that wrestling is 100% racist. I've always stated this. Depending on what company you come from and who owns it and who works in it makes the racism. Look what happened to Alberto Del Rio. Why did Alberto Del Rio have to be fired? Because of a racist comment from one of his own people. And Alberto smacking the shit out of that person. Vince, who probably found out the entire situation, still fired his ass. So that kind of tells you that Vince isn't what he shows on screen. And in this moment on that podcast, I didn't 100% believe in him. When it came to The Undertaker, and this is the other one I'm going to talk about, not talking about anything else. These are the two that I focused on, and I know there's a lot more that was spoken about that were just as good or even more better, but for me, this is what I'm talking about. When it came to The Undertaker, what he stated, saying that there was no one built well enough that The Undertaker could have given his streak to, is a fucking lie. There was more than a few people that could have been done too. And that could have had a longer type of investment in the company. And when he talked about the Brock Lesnar and seeing that Brock doesn't need to be there all the time, and he slipped up later saying that due to his contract, we don't need him all the time, but his contract states he's not supposed to be there. You can see that's double standard. When it came down to it for Steve Austin, he was not willing to say anything about John Cena. And Vince was not willing to say anything about John Cena. Whether you like John or you hate John or you're in between. The best person built to take that streak from The Undertaker, if it wasn't Daniel Bryan getting hurt, or if you're going to be really frank about it, if it wasn't Daniel Bryan, Bray Wyatt, and I know saying Randy Orton wasn't that great, and he's not that great to be used in that respect, those are the most best talents next to John Cena that could have gotten the streak. The best is John Cena, no matter how much you hate him or you love him. He's been there long enough that the crowd 100% behind him, that he is the face of the company. So why in the blue fuck, why the WWE chairman of the board, Vince and Kenny McMahon, would not slate John Cena to be the one to get the fucking streak? And instead of letting John Cena face Bray Wyatt at WrestleMania, it could have been John Cena versus The Undertaker at WrestleMania. I don't really care if the match was going to be great or it's going to be shit. The point is that Vince said there was no one built well enough in the company, and I just spoke about the best person built there, and he didn't say shit. So that makes you see that that podcast, even though it was somewhat detailed, and most of what was stated in the show, his understanding of the fans, him recognizing the internet, him recognizing the changing in the business, which he talked about in Brock Lesnar, which I think he doesn't even understand anymore. You could see the bias in that podcast, but also the sincerity of it. Was it an effective podcast? To me personally, to a degree, yes. They managed to tell what they wanted to tell to the fans. The parts that Vince wanted the fans to know about. The parts to the fans that Stone Cold wanted to tell about himself and about Vince. And what parts of the business they wanted to tell that was acceptable enough that would make them interested in watching the WWE Network. Personally, for me, if this happens again, counting on who it is, I might not watch it. I like the Steve Austin podcast. I've heard it a couple of times. He had James Storm on his podcast. But when you look at this podcast, it was obvious it was biased. Because Steve didn't say anything about The Undertaker facing John Cena. He didn't really say a lot and push Vince too hard on CM Punk. Not saying that he wouldn't push him a little more. Yes, he did talk about Macho Man Randy Savage and did try to grill him a little bit, saying, when is it going to happen? And Vince didn't want to say when. And he said simply, it might not be this year coming in. But I really felt Steve held back to a certain extent. And I'm not against Steve. Steve did what he felt was right for himself. Just like Vince. He's not going to let everyone know all the shit that's going on in his life and in the business and be totally swayed by the fans about it. But was it effective? Yes, to a certain extent it was. The fans, I'm sure, saw what they wanted to see, saw what they didn't want to see, or hear what they wanted to hear, and they're going to have their own controversies about it. It's a middle of the road podcast. That's how I feel about it. So I hope you enjoyed the Zane's View. Please, not Zane's View. This debate of the week, I'm sorry. I'm still thinking about what could happen with Jimmy Uso. And I may do a debate of the week on that one next. That could be coming this week. I got some stuff to do. So you guys have a good day. Have a good night. Peace out.